Let's talk sneaky and stealthy phobos marines today, with a look over infiltrators and incursors and what they can bring to a space marine army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics for another Space Marine unit review, and in this one we're going to be talking about the forward operative phobos units and the value that these bolt carbine armed infantry can bring to the army, capturing objectives, marking targets and disrupting the enemy. In the video we'll talk briefly about the model kit and go on to talk about the infiltrators, then the Incursors Datasheet, many of the obvious buffs and synergies from Index Space Marines, and how strong I'd rate them in game at the moment. Models wise, the Infiltrators and Incursors are Spec Ops Phobos Marines, both built as a slight alternative multi-build out of this kit here, and they basically function as Spec Ops Primaris, scouting forward in their slightly lighter armoured Phobos armour, and deployed in the vanguard of Space Marine forces to disrupt communications, sabotage targets of opportunity, and mark targets for other elements of the army. And they can certainly hit enemy infantry formations very hard indeed in close range firefights with their bolt carbines. The plastic kit from GW is the same as most of the standard Space Marine box sets, £37.50, €50 or $60. Not too bad in terms of the number of points that you get per dollar, around about 3.0, that's goodish for Warhammer 40k. In general, the 10-man Space Marine box sets tend to be at least fairly good value for the points that you get on the table. I'd bear in mind that with the box set kits there is the option of a Phobos Strike Team set, that's the Kill Team box set that does come with some additional 40k relevant bits. There's a few at least fairly cool aesthetic upgrades, though I'd say maybe one of the most meaningful things is the option to make one of the infiltrators a Helix Adept. That does actually have an in-game rule with the 6+ Feel No Pain. It is quite a small part though, to be honest. I feel like there's a lot of people out there who'll just mark out one guy in their squad with some different armor colouring or something and designate him as the medic. It's an extra £5 or $10 compared with the regular plastic kit. I'd bear in mind that infiltrators in particular were previously available in the old Space Marine Combat Patrol box as well. You might occasionally see them going online for a bit cheaper than normal. Those were the monopose models though, and didn't build incursors if that's what you were after. For the kit itself, it's a nice enough, fairly recent Games Workshop plastic kit. They first appeared in the Shadowspear box set back in 8th edition. I'd say the Phobos armour is really liked by some people, but not universally loved. It's got that kind of Spec Ops tactical sort of aesthetic. I feel like in general the majority of chapters might not want to go quite too heavy on it, as it's not what you really imagine on their front lines. Quite nice for certain armies like the Raven Guard though. In terms of options, the main thing for the Infiltrators and Incursors is just a few fairly small swaps. The main differences between the two models are a head swap, a different scanner pack on top, and a slightly different attachment for the bolt carbine. I'm sure people who are less familiar with the Space Marine range might not know the difference too much though. If you are looking to pick some up for 10th edition, then bear in mind that you can also get them cheaper with places like Element Games in the UK or Gap Games in Australia. They usually give either 15% or 20% off, and I'll leave them linked down in the video description. Those links are affiliate links and help support the channel and keep these videos coming if you were thinking about picking some up anyway. Getting onto the rules though, and I thought we'd start out with the Infiltrator Squad. Both the Infiltrators and the Incursors are fairly cheap for Space Marine bodies now, 90 points for 5 of them or 180 for 10, effectively 18 points per model, so a bit cheaper than they used to be in 9th edition. I was kind of interested that these guys aren't really being treated as troops quite so much now. In 9th they used to be troops, so you could take quite a lot of them, plus they have better work on objectives, but now they're not battle line, and they also don't get the boosted objective control, meaning that they are a little bit more weak on objectives than they were. Horde type enemy vehicles might well be able to swing you off an objective. They definitely don't seem quite as resilient on them as when they have objectives secured. The Marines have a fairly standard sort of Space Marine defensive profile. They move 6 inches, toughness 4, a 3+ save and 2 wounds. Space Marines generally have access to Armour of Contempt to make them a little bit tougher, but these guys do also interestingly have the smoke keyword as well, so they can drop a smoke bomb if you want to. That's quite nice for some pop-up light cover if it's going to make the difference, and also stealth at range as well. A lot of the time that could be superior to Armour of Contempt if they are being shot by something with middling AP. Perhaps unsurprisingly, these guys have the Infiltrators keyword. It'd be a bit weird to have a squad called the Infiltrator Squad and for it not to have Infiltrators, and that's the one that means that they can set up in the midfield, likely putting themselves down somewhere out of line of sight in cover, ideally on midfield objectives if they can be. And it is kind of interesting that they're no longer competing with the Incursors for that role as they get scouts. So I guess you'd be weighing them up against things like the regular scout squads plus the Space Marine Eliminators. Having at least some forward deploy units really is quite powerful in the list, means that you can screen back the enemy, get some bodies on midfield objectives, and screen back things like Deep Strike and Reserve that bit easier. the latter bits being particularly good for the Infiltrator squad due to their special rule. War gear first though, and the standard Infiltrators armed with a marksman bolt carbine. This one gives you 2 shots out to 24 inches with a standard bolter profile, strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. It also does have the heavy keyword as well, which means that you'll be hitting on a 2+ if you're static, though in reality I feel like that's maybe a little bit borderline worth. The damage output for the cost just is never really going to be all that exciting at range, only good for bullying some light infantry a little bit, and will do nothing but chip damage to anything else, so getting an extra 25% boost to it actually isn't all that exciting some of the time. I suppose it's a nice to have if you're just standing on an objective that's completely in the open and you didn't want to move anyway. Means they get a little bit of extra firepower, but I feel like in general, if you are going to improve what they're doing by moving them, you're probably just best off doing that and not trying to get an extra average bolter hit or something. It's kind of interesting that they're actually genuinely more threatening in melee than they are at range now. In combat, they get 3 attacks with their regular close combat weapons at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. It does mean that between the two, you could really be doing quite a number on some toughness 3 infantry. You will be stacking quite a lot of wounds between their shooting and charge if you followed one up with the other. Then in 10th edition, they're able to take both of their squad upgrades in the unit, both the Helix Gauntlet and the Infiltrator Comms Array. They get both of those for free, so you may as well have a model to represent them, even if you just paint them a bit differently or something. The Helix Gauntlet gives you a 6+ Feel No Pain type save, so that's really quite a nice durability boost. It makes them a bit more resilient against damage 2 weapons in particular. Passing either one of those 6+ saves will save a Marine's life. They also have the Comms Array as well. This one's a small chance to refund spent CP, so I guess you could use smoke a little bit more efficiently on these guys, for example. You've got a good chance to refund the command point, so it's a bit more efficient there. Definitely not something to be relied on, of course, with a 5+, and just bear in mind that it won't stack with things like getting command points for other sources, like discarding tactical objectives, so occasionally it might be redundant. I think in general the Infiltrator with the Helix Gauntlet wants to be the one that's the last alive in your squad though when they start to take casualties. Really though, the big selling point of the Infiltrators is their Omni Scramblers. This is the rules to allow them to deny reserves all the way out to 12 inches. Really quite a big deal on objectives. It means that if you have these guys holding a point, then the enemy can't drop anywhere near them and can't threaten a long 9-inch charge to potentially wipe the squad and take the objective from you. It's really quite nice just to mean that you've got an entire section of the board locked down that the opponent's reserves are going to be kind of ineffectual against. And it's extra nice against anything that's got rules to drop a bit closer, say for example enemy demons or Genestealer cults. This rule is really quite a big and powerful counter to them. I'd say in 10th edition it's perhaps particularly nice. Reserve seems to be used at least a little bit more commonly. I would bear in mind though that it's maybe not quite as 100% certain guarantee against things like rapid ingress. You could still potentially have a unit drop a unit that's kind of close to these guys and just outside of 12 inches. Then in their turn they'll be able to move, so they could still threaten a charge on you if you can't kill them with your own shooting or something. Overall though, it's still a very good rule. It makes them both pretty excellent either for a home field objective or a midfield objective, and you could maybe deploy them differently depending on the enemy. It is quite powerful to just know that your opponent can't drop anywhere within 12 inches of them in the backfield. Makes them pretty excellent for screening out there without too much effort. And I'd argue that this rule is the main reason that you'll want to bring the unit in the first place. Overall, fairly standardish Marines, a bit tougher and can set up where you want, and lock down that section of the board so reserves can't drop too close. Moving on to their paired combat blade counterparts though, and we have the Incursors. These guys cost the same points now, at either 90 or 180 once more, and do have quite a lot of similarities. They've got the same sort of basic profile with a standard Space Marine stat line, with Objective Control 1 and Smoke, but now their special rules and equipment and things do make their role kind of different. Perhaps one of the biggest differences compared with 9th edition is they've swapped out the Infiltrators keyword for Scouts, so you are actually going to have to drop them in your own deployment zone now, and they're going to be more of a force that's just moving up towards the midfield and getting there a bit earlier than most. You could still be on a midfield objective turn 1 between a scout move and a normal move. I guess in theory they might be competing against the other scouts units within Codex Space Marines, Reavers, the Invictus Tactical Warsuit, the actual Scout Squad, again perhaps unsurprisingly, and Vanguard veterans on foot. I feel within that list though they do have a pretty good niche and bring quite a lot to the table. Overall I'd say their damage output per model is a bit better than the Infiltrators. Their bolt carbine doesn't have heavy so it won't be hitting on 2+, but instead it gets both assault and ignore cover as well. And between the two of those I'd say that's generally going to be more helpful than heavy for the most part. Means they can move moving around the board really quite quickly and still snapping off shots. and ignores cover in 10th edition is often going to translate to effectively an extra pip of AP against a lot of targets. Overall, I'd definitely rather have those pair of keywords as opposed to the static +1 to hit. Does mean as well they don't have to compromise between advancing onto objectives and not being able to fire as well, which is cool. It means they could scout up 6 inches to somewhere close, and then have the first turn plan be to advance onto objectives, fire off a bunch of shots with the assault keyword, and also mark an enemy target with their special rule. In melee as well, again they're a little bit more threatening and a bit more punchy for these guys. Their paired combat blades now gives them exploding 6s to hit, so you're averaging around about 2 or 3 hits on the target per guy. A little bit better than the Infiltrators can manage, though maybe not enormously significantly. What actually makes them a little bit more threat in combat though is probably that Haywire Mine. This one's quite a fun special rule where you're almost guaranteed to get a small win of a few mortal wounds at the enemy, and you can do that the first time they make contact with the enemy in combat, whether or not they charged or got charged themselves. You trigger it at the start of any phase if the enemy is within 3 inches, so you don't always have to charge if it doesn't make sense. And then you've got a 2+ chance for D3 mortal wounds on the enemy unit, going up to a big 2d3 against enemy vehicles, which is kind of massive. Not really too bad for a little sting in the tail for some fairly expendable frontline infantry that are perhaps more there to mark targets. I think there's a very good chance they might wind up in combat, seeing as they're often going to be on the front line. I do find it kind of hilarious that they could mount quite a powerful attack against an enemy vehicle as well. You could potentially move up and have the haywire attack go off for usually around 4 mortal wounds, and then you could even double down on it with a grenade stratagem, so in theory around about 7 mortal wounds on an enemy vehicle out of an Incursor squad if you're willing to spend a CP. Seems like that could be quite a surprising damage move on paper. As with the Infiltrators though, I think that the real reason that you bring these guys is for their special rule. Their multi-spectrum array rule is the one that allows you to mark one target that you've hit in the shooting phase, and then it basically lights that up for the rest of the Space Marine army, giving them a +1 to hit for potentially really quite a lot of focused gunfire. I feel like this rule makes the Incursors a very interesting unit to have one of in an army. For 90 points, you could potentially be giving a +25% damage boost to theoretically about half the Space Marine army if you really wanted to. If they're part of a big firebase, they could make the rest of that firebase really quite a lot more efficient. It could also be something that you could stack with the other Space Marine damage buffs, say for example an Oath of Moment, or the various things that Storm Speeders could give you if you're running them. If you stack it with Oath of Moment, it's maybe a bit of a side grade. You were probably going to hit most of those hits anyway, so it only in theory translates to around a 9% damage boost. But you could also argue that that 9% damage boost is a lot more valuable on Oath of Moment targets, as of course you're far more likely to wound as you've got the full wound rerolls going as well. Between that, I think it's kind of viable that you could either fire these at a different target or into the target that you're using Oath of Moment on to make the Oath just extra dangerous. It is maybe a special rule though that's going to be a lot more valuable if you've just got one really heavy target that you can focus with a whole bunch of your guns. If that doesn't exist in the enemy army, it's going to be far more lackluster. For buffs and synergies and things, I feel like both of the units are typically ones that you'd want to run in small units and not keep them very high investment. They might just be able to benefit from a few things opportunistically though. Oath of Moment I feel like probably isn't really the biggest deal besides choosing where you put the Incursor buff on. It could help a bit with their bolt carbine damage. I guess could be okay if you just absolutely desperately need to clear a light infantry unit and these guys are the only ones that can do it, but I feel like most of the time you're almost certainly going to have better targets. Otherwise, the combat doctrines are all kind of useful enough. Maybe the assault doctrine is particularly interesting for Incursors. You could get to move in advance, then shoot with their bolt carbines, and then follow up with a charge. Again, could be interesting enough with trying to clear some light infantry or an objective, maybe. Otherwise, I suppose the Devastator one could be situationally good for the Infiltrators, and given that these guys seem to be likely to get into combat a fair bit, being on the front line, tactical could be okay to fall back and shoot, but even then it is still bolter shots. Otherwise, for the most part, these guys wouldn't be my first choice to spend stratagems on. Usually there's going to be bigger and better units to do that with, but still in the right situation, if it helps them get the jump over an enemy similar unit, it could be quite a big deal for the game. Say for example, if they overcome a unit of their peers, and then you're just scoring an objective all game long as a result. For that sort of thing, Honour the Chapter seems quite good. Lance Melee with an extra AP -1 and Assault Doctrine actually changes these guys from being kind of bad in combat to at least fairly intimidating for medium infantry. An Incursor squad with that on the charge averages around about 2 dead Space Marines, which isn't terrible. Still kind of depends on the situation though, just for raw damage not enormously exciting. Otherwise, durability ones like Armour of Contempt or Smoke could both be relevant. If it's going to make the difference between them living or dying on an objective, then that could be worth victory points. And they could be an interesting enough unit to use squad tactics with, move d6 inches reactively and keep them safe, or potentially backpedal from an enemy charge if that is going to make the difference between the unit being wiped in combat or having them survive for another turn. Again though, probably all a bit situational. I wouldn't go out of my way to spend loads of CP on them. Next up are the phobos character options. Again, I probably would say that most of the time I wouldn't be too tempted to put a character in them. I feel like both units work best in 5-man units. For the Incursors, that's the best way to get the advantage of their special rule. You can have 2 copies of that and 2 haywire mines if you took 2 similar units. And for the Infiltrators, you could be zoning out 2 different areas of the board with their comms arrays. I just don't think that you're really gaining all that much by squadding up. To be honest, I think that the single best argument, I suppose, for making a bigger squad is if you really desperately wanted to use one of these phobos character options, but given that these cost a fair bit of points in their own right, I feel like it's just maybe a bit questionable, unless you're going for some sort of fun phobos build and you want to make one of them work. The 3 main options to join them are the phobos captain for 80 points, he gives you 0 CP stratagems and a redeploy, the phobos lieutenant for lethal hits and a move shoot move ability, and the Phobos Librarian for his AP-1 force weapon to chip into combat, and the unit can't be shot at greater than 12-inch range. To be fair to them, I think they are all interesting buffs for these units, all pretty powerful in their own way, but maybe it's just throwing points after a unit that's already not all that dangerous on the board in the first place. The Captain's redeploy could definitely allow you to do some big plays with putting 4 deploy units forward and then shielding them back if the enemy gets first turn. It is one of the rules that you actually get to know first turn before the redeploy, and that's kind of unusual in 40k. The Lieutenant gets you lethal hits and the move shoot move, makes them a little bit more dangerous, though I'd say probably worth just putting the points towards another squad realistically. If you want a move shoot move type squad, then maybe just go for the Eliminators, who can do that with their Instigator bolt carbine anyway. Finally, the Phobos Librarian I think is interesting. Not being shot at greater than 12 inches is quite a big deal. Could really be quite disruptive in some games if the opponent only has ways to clear one of your units on an objective via shooting, but still I do feel like you're paying a really big premium for that rule at 75 points, though I guess at least compared with the other 2 characters he adds a little bit more melee punch and chips in with smite at range as well. Overall I generally consider all of these a bit more fun and fluffy picks despite the interesting abilities that they bring. I think if you did want to build around one of them though, it wouldn't be the worst in the world. Could give you a really interesting luxury utility option for the unit, and probably wouldn't hold back an efficient list all that much. In a similar vein though, probably transports aren't the single best idea for these guys. I feel like in general you'd want a more valuable unit in terms of damage dealing to justify things like repulsors or impulsors. Again, if I was taking a transport for these guys, I'd probably just weigh it up against more of these or a different squad altogether. I say for specific chapters, compared with some of the more mainline damage dealers, there isn't really quite as much going on for these guys. They generally just do what they do and are kind of happy in most of the forces. I think it will be interesting to see if we get some sort of Phobos and Stealth type Space Marine detachment when their Codex comes out though. I feel like that's probably quite a good chance of that happening. Otherwise though, I'd say Black Templars might find a little less value from Infiltrators in specific, due to them doubling up with the Feel No Pain type save. Still kind of fine though, as the main thing that you'd probably take them for are the Omni Scramblers. I guess Blood Angels could make something like an Incursor unit significantly more threatening to medium infantry and melee. +1 attack and +1 strength does make them hit significantly harder, could bully light infantry a bit better there. And I guess Deathwatch might well like the Incursors to help them mark targets for a +1 to hit for all their ranged warfare. That's going to be a trade-off versus taking more bodies in kill teams though, so again it's probably not all win there either. In general though, I'd just say that they work kind of fine for the majority of chapters. I think Infiltrators are usually good to have in virtually any army. I'd say for Incursors you probably want the force to have at least a fair amount of ranged guns, otherwise you're not going to get enough value from their rule. Finally, just for an overall take, I'd say that Infiltrators are good for their forward deploy, good for being fairly cheap marine bodies with a 6+ Feel No Pain and some defensive stratagems, and in particular the Omni Scramblers is the best reason to take the unit. For weaknesses, their damage output is really quite poor besides against light infantry, and Objective Control 1 isn't really all that great. Overall I'd say they are usable though in a competitive Space Marine list, lock down a home field objective or screen out some deep strike from the midfield. Generally some nice enough, annoying tough marine bodies. I guess you'd probably want to be weighing them up against Eliminators with a bit more actual damage output and threat with the sniper rifles, plus move shoot move options. And for another interesting forward deploy unit, you could also consider the Scout Snipers, who aren't able to be shot greater than 12 inches away, though bear in mind that Games Workshop's retiring their unit kit. Whether there's still an option in the new Space Marine Codex probably depends on whether or not they come out with a new one. Otherwise, for their Incursors, I'd say certainly their greatest strength is the special rule to mark a target. Otherwise, being Scout, fairly cheap, and a little bit more melee than the Infiltrators is all interesting. That Haywire Bomb is definitely a nice to have. As for downsides though, they don't have any forward deploy. Objective Control 1 isn't great, and again they just don't really do much damage besides light infantry. And I feel like their buff is going to be a lot more helpful in some games than others. Ideally you want something that's going to be meaningful if you shoot a whole load of guns at it, as opposed to just guerrilla warfare type things that die easily anyway. They're definitely a lot more helpful to ranged armies compared with melee as well. Overall, I'd certainly rate these guys as pretty strong, though I think I'd be probably most tempted just to take one unit of them as opposed to two or more. Just feels like, as the +1 to hit buff is probably the most valuable thing, you probably don't want more than one copy of it as you just get into diminishing returns. Seem pretty solid for that kind of rule though, particularly in a big Space Marine gunline list where you've got loads of weapons that might benefit. Let me know what you make of these guys though. Have you been making much use of these phobos carbine armed troops in game at the moment, and have they been a valuable force in winning the mission overall? Look forward to your insights down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.